Hello, friends. This is not a topic most of us want to think about on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and I understand that completely. I genuinely do. But there is a very real and very practical reason to know what I am about to cover today. And that reason is not to make you feel anxious or uncomfortable. The reason is this: the people who plan ahead, the people who take 30 minutes on a calm afternoon to understand how this system actually works, are the people who protect themselves and their families from being taken advantage of during the most vulnerable moment any family goes through. And what is happening right now in the funeral industry in 2026 makes that preparation more important than it has ever been in the past 3 decades. The funeral industry in the United States is going through its biggest transformation since the Federal Trade Commission first created consumer protection rules for it back in 1984. New federal regulations are in final stages of implementation. New permanent bans on specific deceptive practices are being put in place. New options are becoming available that most seniors have never heard of. And new warnings are being issued directly by federal agencies about practices that have been quietly costing American families billions of dollars in unnecessary charges for years. Today, I am going through all of it calmly, practically, and without any pressure, so that when the time comes, you and your family are informed enough to make decisions that actually serve your interests rather than the financial interests of an industry that has historically profited from grief and urgency. Before we get into it, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. I cover exactly this kind of information: changes that affect your money and your family's financial security that most people only find out about after the fact, after the decision has already been made and the money has already been spent. Subscribe now and let us get into everything you need to know. Let me start with the most important thing, and the reason federal regulators have been actively investigating the funeral industry for years with increasing urgency leading up to these 2026 rule changes. When a family loses someone they love, they are grieving. They are exhausted. They have not slept properly. They are making decisions in an emotional state while simultaneously managing phone calls, travel arrangements, out-of-town relatives, employer notifications, and the administrative reality of a loss that touches every corner of daily life. The funeral industry has known this for a very long time, and according to extensive documentation from the Federal Trade Commission, a significant number of funeral homes have historically used that emotional vulnerability deliberately and systematically to charge families for services they do not need, to obscure the prices of less expensive options that are legally available, and to state directly that certain services are legally required when they are absolutely not required by law anywhere in the country. The scale of this problem is not small, and it is not isolated to a few bad actors. The FTC's own undercover investigators placed calls to more than 250 funeral homes across the country as part of their enforcement review leading up to the 2026 rule updates. And they found violations of existing federal pricing rules in 39 of those calls. Not 39 out of 250,000, 39 out of 250 calls placed. In 38 of those cases, the funeral home either refused to answer basic pricing questions at all or gave inconsistent and contradictory prices for services that were identical. In one extensively documented case that became a centerpiece of the FTC's regulatory argument for stronger rules, a funeral home representative told a caller directly that local health code required embalming. That statement was a lie. Embalming is not required by law in the vast majority of circumstances in the United States. It is not required federally. It is not required in most states. And the very specific and narrow circumstances under which it can be required, such as certain types of interstate transportation of remains, are nothing like the scenario the caller described. The funeral home was charging over $700 for a service the family had zero legal obligation to purchase, and the representative was using the authority of invented law to prevent the family from asking questions or pushing back. The Wall Street Journal conducted a separate and independent investigation from the FTC's review, and their reporters identified over 500 funeral homes across the country engaged in documented deceptive practices, including systematic overcharging, hidden fees added after initial pricing conversations, bait and switch pricing, where families were quoted one price on the phone and presented with a significantly higher bill after they had already committed emotionally to the arrangement, and in multiple cases, charging for services that were never performed at all. What makes this situation particularly difficult for consumers is a unique structural arrangement between the FTC and the funeral industry's primary lobbying organization that has existed for years. Under this arrangement, most documented violations do not result in public disclosure. The funeral home pays into an industry-managed remediation fund, and the violation is handled privately. The family that was overcharged never finds out. The public never finds out. The funeral home continues operating without any public record of the violation that would allow future families to make an informed choice about whether to use that provider. This arrangement has allowed a pattern of consumer harm to persist across a significant portion of the industry for decades without the public accountability that normally functions as a market correction mechanism. This is the backdrop, the documented and federally acknowledged backdrop for what is now changing in 2026. And the changes are meaningful. They are specific, and they include permanent bans on practices that have been standard operating procedure at a troubling number of funeral homes for the past 30 years. The FTC's funeral rule was created in 1984 and last significantly updated in 1994. 1994, before most American households had internet access, before it was possible for a consumer to research any service provider from their home before making a decision. Under the rule, as it existed through 2025, funeral homes were required to provide an itemized general price list in person when a family requested it and to give accurate pricing over the phone if a consumer called to ask. But they were not required to publish their prices on their website. They were not required to make pricing available online in any format. That single gap in the rule, the online pricing gap, is the structural mechanism through which most of the consumer harm in this industry has operated for the past 2 decades. Because you cannot compare prices from home. You cannot do research at your kitchen table on a calm afternoon before any loss has occurred. You have to walk into a funeral home already grieving, already exhausted, already emotionally vulnerable before you can find out what anything costs. And that is precisely and intentionally the environment in which overcharging happens most effectively. The 2026 updates that are now in final implementation address this directly. The updated rule being implemented in 2026 permanently bans funeral homes from operating without publicly available online pricing. Full general price lists are now required to be published on the funeral home's website in a standardized format that allows direct comparison between providers. This is not optional. It is not a recommendation. It is a requirement with enforcement mechanisms attached, and failure to comply is now treated as an unfair or deceptive act under Section 5 of the FTC Act, which carries civil penalties of over $50,000 per violation per day. More than 60% of funeral homes in the United States did not have their prices on their website as of the beginning of 2026. Every single one of those providers is now required to come into compliance. The permanent ban on hiding prices from consumers who cannot yet visit a funeral home in person is one of the most significant consumer protection changes in this industry in 30 years, and most seniors have not heard about it. The second permanent ban being implemented in 2026 targets the practice of required package purchasing. Under the updated rule, funeral homes are now permanently prohibited from requiring consumers to purchase bundled packages of services as a condition of receiving any individual service. The specific practice being banned is one that has been widespread in the industry. A family calls a funeral home and asks about the cost of a specific service. The funeral home responds that the service is only available as part of a package that includes 8 other services the family does not want and did not ask about. The package costs $9,000. the individual service the family actually needs costs $400. The funeral home refuses to sell the individual service without the package. Under the 2026 rule updates, this practice is now permanently banned. Funeral homes are required to itemize all available services and make them available for individual purchase. A family that wants only direct cremation without any additional preparation, viewing, or ceremony services is entitled to receive that service without being required to purchase anything else. A family that wants a graveside service without a funeral home chapel service is entitled to purchase exactly that. The itemized right to purchase only what you actually want and need is now permanently protected under federal law in a way that it was not clearly and enforceable before 2026. The third permanent ban addresses something that has been used with striking frequency to pressure families into services they did not want and did not need. Funeral homes are now permanently banned from making representations about legal requirements that are not grounded in actual law applicable to the specific circumstances. The documentation underlying this ban is extensive. FTC investigators found in call after call funeral home representatives stating that state law required embalming, that local health codes required a specific type of burial container, that regulations required a certain minimum level of preparation before viewing, and that various other services were legally mandatory when none of those representations were true. Under the 2026 permanent ban, any funeral home that tells a family that a service is legally required must now be able to cite the specific law or regulation by name and jurisdiction. If they cannot cite the specific law, the claim is presumptively deceptive and subject to enforcement action. The practical effect of this ban is significant. Embalming, which is not required by law in the vast majority of circumstances in this country, generates hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue for the funeral industry, a large portion of it from families who were told they had no choice. That revenue stream is now permanently at risk because the legal justification that was being invented to support it has been banned. Now let me walk you through what is changing in how Americans are choosing to handle final arrangements. Because the options available in 2026 are genuinely different and in some cases dramatically less expensive than what was available even a decade ago. And most seniors are not aware of the full range of what is now legally available to them. The national cremation rate in the United States surpassed 63% in 2025 and continues to climb throughout 2026. The single biggest driver of that shift is cost. And the cost difference is not marginal. A traditional funeral with burial, including the funeral home's professional services, the casket, embalming and preparation, the chapel service, transportation, and cemetery expenses, including the plot, opening and closing fees, and grave marker, now costs between $8,000 and $12,000 on average nationally. In major metropolitan areas, that number is frequently significantly higher. In New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, a traditional Fullervis funeral can easily cost between $15,000 and $25,000, depending on the specific choices made. Direct cremation, in which the body is cremated without a viewing, embalming, ceremony at the funeral home, or elaborate preparation, typically costs between $1,500 and $2,500. For that cost, the family receives the cremated remains. They then choose when, where, and how to hold a memorial service entirely on their own terms in a location that is meaningful to them on a timeline that works for the family, rather than for the funeral home's scheduling. Parks, restaurants, private homes, backyards, community centers, places of worship, public spaces with personal significance. The memorial can happen days or weeks after the cremation, when family members have had time to travel and when the immediate shock of loss has settled enough for the family to be present for the gathering in a meaningful way, rather than rushing through a service 48 hours after the death while still in a state of acute grief. Beyond traditional cremation, two newer options are now legally available in a growing number of states in 2026 and are worth understanding because many seniors have never heard of them and some have strong personal or environmental reasons to prefer them. Alkaline hydrolysis, which is sometimes called water cremation or aquamation, uses a combination of water, heat, and an alkaline solution to facilitate the natural decomposition of the body in a process that produces no atmospheric emissions and uses significantly less energy than traditional flame cremation. The process takes several hours, and the result is similar to traditional cremation in that the family receives remains that can be kept, scattered, or interred. As of 2026, alkaline hydrolysis is now legal in the majority of U.S. states. The cost is generally comparable to traditional flame cremation, making it an option that is financially accessible to the same families who would choose direct cremation with the added benefit of a significantly reduced environmental footprint. For seniors who have strong environmental values or who live in states where this option has recently become available, it is worth knowing that it exists and that the legal landscape has shifted substantially in the past 3 years. Human composting, officially referred to as natural organic reduction, is now legal in Colorado, Washington, California, New York, Oregon, Vermont, and several additional states that have passed enabling legislation in recent years. The process involves placing the body in a specialized vessel with organic material, including wood chips, straw, and other natural elements. And over a period of several weeks, the body transforms through natural microbial activity into nutrient-rich soil. The resulting soil material can be given to the family for use in a garden or on property, donated to conservation land, or directed to a land trust or environmental organization designated by the family. Colorado most recently moved this forward with additional protective legislation signed in April 2026 that clarified the regulatory framework and expanded the number of licensed providers authorized to offer the service for seniors with strong environmental commitments. This option now exists, is legally protected in a growing number of states, and is being offered by an increasing number of providers. The cost as of 2026 is generally in the range of $3,000 to $7,000 depending on the provider and the state, which is significantly less than a traditional funeral with burial, while providing an outcome that many families find more meaningful and more consistent with the values of the person who has died. Now, I want to cover something that could directly and significantly affect the financial planning of millions of seniors currently watching this, because it involves money that many of you already have set aside in accounts you have been told you cannot use for this purpose. There is legislation actively moving through Congress in 2026 called the Funeral Coverage Act. If this legislation passes, and as of the date of this video, it is being actively debated with meaningful bipartisan support in both chambers, it would allow Americans to use funds from their health savings account, their HSA, to pay for funeral and final disposition expenses. Currently, HSA funds can only be used for qualified medical expenses as defined by the IRS. Funeral and burial costs are explicitly excluded from that definition. This means that millions of Americans who have accumulated significant balances in their HSA accounts over years of contributions, sometimes balances of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 or more, cannot currently use those funds to cover end-of-life planning expenses, even though doing so would be a rational and practical use of savings that are otherwise restricted to medical purposes. The proposed change under the Funeral Coverage Act would allow HSA funds to be used for funeral home services, cremation, burial, and other final disposition expenses. For a senior with a meaningful HSA balance and a desire to pre-plan their final arrangements without drawing down other savings or creating a financial burden for their family, this legislative change would be significant. As of June 2026, the legislation has cleared committee review in the Senate and is being considered for inclusion in a broader financial services package. It is not passed yet, but the trajectory is meaningful enough that seniors with HSA balances should be aware that this option may become available within the current legislative year, and that financial planning conversations with an advisor should account for the possibility. I also want to make sure every senior watching this understands what pre-planning is, what it is not, and what the specific risks and protections associated with it look like in 2026. Because this is an area where seniors have historically been vulnerable to a different and more personal form of financial exploitation than the overcharging that happens at the time of death. Pre-planning or pre-arrangement refers to the process of selecting and, in some cases, prepaying for funeral services in advance of need. There are legitimate reasons why pre-planning makes sense for many seniors. It removes the burden of decision-making from family members at the time of loss. It locks in prices at current rates in an industry where costs have been increasing steadily. It ensures that the arrangements reflect the actual wishes of the person who has died rather than the assumptions or preferences of surviving family members. And done correctly with the right legal protections in place, it can be a financially sound approach to a significant and certain future expense. But done incorrectly or with a provider that does not have appropriate consumer protections in place, prepayment of funeral expenses can result in significant financial loss. Before the 2026 rule updates strengthened protections in this area, families had lost prepaid funeral funds through funeral home bankruptcies, through ownership transfers where new owners did not honor pre-arrangements made under previous management, and through a variety of situations where funds that were supposed to be held in trust were not properly protected. The 2026 rule updates include new requirements for how prepaid funeral funds must be handled. Funds paid in advance to a funeral home for future services must now be held in a state-regulated trust account or in an insurance product that carries the consumer's name as the beneficiary. The funeral home cannot use prepaid funds for operating expenses. The consumer has the right to a full accounting of where the funds are held and how they are invested. And in the event that the funeral home goes out of business or is sold, the consumer's prepaid funds must be fully portable, meaning the consumer can transfer the prepaid arrangement to a different funeral home and receive full credit for the amount already paid. These protections are meaningfully stronger than what existed under the previous version of the rule, and they significantly reduce the risk that prepaid funeral funds will be lost through the kinds of business events that have historically affected prepaid consumers. There are specific things I want every senior watching this to know about their rights under the current law, regardless of whether any additional changes happen, because these rights exist today, and most seniors are not aware of them and therefore cannot exercise them. Under the FTC funeral rule as it currently stands and as strengthened by the 2026 updates, every funeral home in the United States must give you a written general price list that is yours to keep without any obligation to purchase anything. They must provide accurate pricing over the telephone if you call to ask, and they cannot require you to give your name, your address, your phone number, or any other identifying information before answering your pricing questions. You have the right to choose only the individual services you want, and they cannot require you to purchase a bundled package as a condition of receiving any specific service. They cannot tell you that any service is legally required without being able to cite the specific law that requires it in your specific circumstances. They must disclose in writing any fees that they add to the cost of merchandise or services they obtain from third parties on your behalf, such as death certificates, obituary notices, or cemetery charges. And if you provide your own casket or urn, the funeral home cannot charge you a handling fee for using merchandise you purchased elsewhere. That practice, charging a fee simply because you brought your own casket from a third-party retailer, was a common way for funeral homes to recapture revenue from price-conscious consumers. And under the updated 2026 rules, it is permanently prohibited. Let me also address something that affects a growing number of seniors in 2026, specifically because of the intersection between funeral planning and Medicaid eligibility. For seniors who are at or near Medicaid eligibility thresholds, the question of how funeral and burial expenses interact with the asset tests used to determine Medicaid qualification is genuinely important. Most states allow seniors to set aside a specified amount for funeral and burial expenses in what is called an irrevocable prepaid funeral trust, and those funds are typically excluded from the asset calculations used to determine Medicaid eligibility. The specific amount that can be excluded varies by state, but in many states it is between $5,000 and $15,000 per person. Clears throat. This means that a senior who is planning for the possibility of needing Medicaid-funded long-term care at some point in the future may have a legitimate financial planning reason, completely separate from any preference about funeral arrangements, to establish an irrevocable prepaid funeral trust. Now the funds set aside in that trust reduce countable assets for Medicaid purposes are protected from Medicaid estate recovery in most states and guarantee that resources exist to cover final expenses without becoming a financial burden on surviving family members. This is not a planning strategy that is widely discussed in mainstream financial planning for seniors, and it is one that the 2026 changes to funeral industry rules have made more accessible and more secure because of the stronger trust fund protections now in place. Let me close with the specific practical steps that protect you and your family right now today based on everything I have covered. The first step is to understand that you have the right to request the general price list from any funeral home before you discuss anything else, make any decisions, or give them any personal information. This is your federal right under the FTC Funeral Rule. The price list must be given to you in writing and must itemize every service and its individual cost. If a funeral home resists providing it, delays providing it, or tells you that you need to make some preliminary decision or provide some information before they can share pricing, that resistance is itself a significant warning sign about how that provider operates, and you should treat it accordingly. The second step is to compare prices across at least 2 and ideally 3 providers before committing to any arrangement, whether you are pre-planning or making arrangements at the time of loss. Under the current FTC rule and the 2026 updates, you can do this entirely by phone if you choose without walking into any provider's premises and without giving your name to anyone. The price differences between providers for identical services in the same geographic area can be enormous. Multiple studies have found price differences of 300% and 400% for the same service in the same market. There is no quality justification for that spread. In most cases, it is simply price variation that consumers cannot see because the industry has historically not been required to make prices visible. The third step, if you are doing any pre-planning, is to clear's throat document your wishes in writing to make sure those wishes are specific enough that your family will not be left guessing, and to tell at least 2 people you trust where those documents are kept. The families who end up paying the most, who make decisions they later regret, and who are most vulnerable to the practices that the new permanent bans are targeting are overwhelmingly families who had no prior guidance, who were making every decision under time pressure, who had no idea what the person who died actually wanted, and who therefore defaulted to whatever the funeral home suggested as standard. Any decision made slowly with accurate information and without time pressure will almost always be a better decision than one made in grief and urgency with no frame of reference. The new rules make information more accessible. They do not eliminate the value of having thought through these decisions before the moment of loss arrives. The fourth step is specific to seniors who are near Medicaid eligibility thresholds. Ask your elder law attorney or your financial advisor specifically about the irrevocable prepaid funeral trust as an asset planning tool in your state. The intersection between funeral pre-planning and Medicaid asset protection is a legitimate and underutilized planning strategy that the 2026 changes have made more secure, and it is one that very few seniors are aware of without specific guidance. The fifth step is to be aware that starting now in 2026, funeral home pricing is required to be available online. If you are researching providers, you can and should check their websites for published pricing before making any contact. If a funeral home's website does not have pricing published in 2026, that provider is not in compliance with the updated federal rule. That is information worth having before you decide whether to engage with that provider. Here is the summary of everything that is permanently changing in 2026 that you need to know. The FTC's updated funeral rule permanently bans funeral homes from hiding prices by failing to publish them online. Full itemized general price lists are now required on every funeral home's website. The practice of requiring consumers to purchase bundled packages as a condition of any individual service is permanently banned. The practice of claiming services are legally required without being able to cite the specific law that requires them is permanently banned. Prepaid funeral funds must now be held in regulated trust accounts or insurance products with the consumer as beneficiary, must be fully portable if the funeral home closes or is sold, and must be fully accountable to the consumer on request. The Funeral Coverage Act, currently moving through Congress, would allow HSA funds to be used for final disposition expenses, a change that could affect millions of seniors with existing HSA balances. And new disposition options, including alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction, are now legally available in a growing number of states at costs that are substantially lower than traditional burial. None of this is designed to be alarming. It is designed to be useful. The funeral industry is one of the few industries in America where the people with the least emotional capacity to make good decisions are routinely expected to make some of the most significant financial decisions of their lives in a compressed time frame with historically limited access to the price information they need to make informed choices. The 2026 permanent bans and rule updates address the structural conditions that made that situation possible. Knowing what those changes are, knowing what your rights are, and taking 30 minutes to think through your preferences before any loss occurs are the things that protect you and protect your family. Share this with someone in your family who handles planning and subscribe so that when the next round of changes arrives, you hear about it here in plain language before it affects